It is July 22nd, 2026, and at 8:15 in the evening Eastern Time last night, U.S. Central Command posted 11 words to a social media account that most Americans will never read. The 11th consecutive evening of strikes against Iran was complete. 11 nights. Not 11 days of tension, not 11 days of warnings, not 11 days of diplomatic signaling. 11 consecutive nights of American aircraft, American warships, and American precision munitions striking targets inside a sovereign country of 90 million people. And a few hours later, in the eastern and western districts of Greater Tehran, air defense systems came alive and began engaging what Iranian state media described as hostile targets over the capital itself. Residents of Bandar Abbas described something specific. They said the blasts came from the direction of the sea. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly why. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building. And the story does not start 11 nights ago. It starts on the 28th of February. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel conducted a coordinated series of strikes across Iranian territory. Those strikes hit military targets, command infrastructure, and one compound in particular. Inside that compound was Ali Khamenei, the man who had held absolute authority over the Islamic Republic since 1989. He had outlasted 6 American presidents. He had survived the Iran-Iraq War, the reformist movement, the Green Movement, the 2019 protests, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and the 12-day war of June 2025. On February 28th, 2026, he did not survive. Understand what that means institutionally. The supreme leader in the Iranian system is not a ceremonial figure and not merely a head of state. He is the final arbiter of foreign policy, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the authority who appoints the head of the judiciary, the head of state media, and the commanders of both the regular army and the Revolutionary Guard. Every major strategic decision in that country for 37 years passed through one office and one man, and then it did not. What followed was the fastest and most consequential leadership transition in the history of the Islamic Republic. Under Article 111 of the Constitution, a 3-member Provisional Leadership Council took over on March 1st, consisting of President Masoud Pezeshkian, Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, and Alireza Arafi of the Guardian Council. That council held authority for exactly 7 days. On March 8th, the Assembly of Experts named Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the man who had just been killed, as the 3rd supreme leader of Iran. And here is the part that almost nobody outside of specialist circles has properly absorbed. Mojtaba Khamenei was in the compound too. He was injured in the same airstrike that killed his father, and after his appointment, he disappeared from public view for an extended period, long enough that there was open confusion inside Iran about whether he was alive, whether he was capable of governing, and whether the appointment was a genuine transfer of power or a placeholder designed to prevent the system from visibly fracturing. Hold on to that. It becomes the single most important variable in everything that follows. Because on March 4th, 4 days after the supreme leader was killed, Iranian forces declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Not restricted, not subject to inspection, closed. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps transmitted warnings over VHF radio to every vessel in the waterway, stating that no ship was permitted to pass. The British Royal Navy assessed correctly that the declaration had no basis in international law, but also noted that legality is not the same thing as safety, and shipping companies are not in the business of testing legal theories with $200 million hulls and 25-man crews. The effect was immediate, and it was catastrophic. In February 2026, a daily average of 135 vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz. By March 3rd, that number was 7. 7 vessels, a collapse of roughly 95% in the space of 72 hours. Iraq, the second largest crude producer in OPEC, declared force majeure and cut nearly 1.5 million barrels per day of output because it physically could not get its product to market. Roughly 27% of the world's seaborne trade in crude oil and petroleum products moves through that waterway. Around 20% of global liquefied natural gas moves through it, and it stopped. Oil went from the 70s to over $90 a barrel within days. By mid-March, Brent was above 102. By late March, it topped 99 on WTI, and the OPEC basket was pricing at 126. By late April, Brent hit a wartime high of over $188 a barrel. The American national average for gasoline jumped 32 cents. Diesel jumped 51 cents in a single week. China ordered its state refiners to halt diesel and gasoline exports and prioritize domestic supply, which is what a country does when it believes the disruption is going to last. That is the leverage Iran discovered it was holding. And that is the entire strategic logic of everything that has happened since. Because Iran did not close the Strait of Hormuz out of rage. It closed it because it is the single most valuable card the Islamic Republic has ever held. And it played that card at the exact moment its leadership had been decapitated and its conventional military options had been reduced to almost nothing. Tehran cannot defeat the United States Navy. It cannot contest air superiority. It cannot protect its own airspace. What it can do is put a rifle to the throat of 20% of the world's energy supply and dare Washington to pull the trigger anyway. On March 19th, the United States began a sustained aerial campaign specifically aimed at destroying Iran's ability to interdict shipping. From April 13th to May 29th, the U.S. Navy blockaded Iranian ports outright. In early May, Washington began a naval escort operation, running convoys of commercial vessels through the strait under American protection. And in June, after months of attritional violence, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding intended to end the war and keep the strait open. Brent crude fell back toward $72. Shipping insurers cautiously reopened. Analysts began writing about recovery. For a few weeks, it looked like the most dangerous confrontation of the decade had found an off-ramp. That memorandum lasted roughly a month. Now here is where the story changes completely. On July 7th, Iranian forces attacked 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has since laid out the American account of what the memorandum required. Iran was expected to reaffirm that the waterway would remain open to commercial shipping and to stop firing on vessels. Rubio's framing of the American position is worth understanding precisely because it is the doctrinal core of the entire U.S. posture. He described the Strait of Hormuz as an international waterway in the same category as the South China Sea and stated the American position as no tolls, no restrictions, free passage for all ships of commerce. No tolls. Read that carefully because that single phrase is the entire war. Iran's objective in this conflict was never the destruction of American shipping. It was never even, primarily, the punishment of the United States. Iran's objective has been to establish that transit through the Strait of Hormuz occurs by Iranian permission. Not by international law, not by freedom of navigation, not by American naval escort, by Iranian arrangement. Because the moment that principle is conceded, even informally, even quietly, Tehran acquires permanent structural leverage over the global economy that no sanctions regime can ever take away, and no airstrike can ever destroy. A toll booth on 20% of the world's oil is worth more to the Islamic Republic than its entire nuclear program ever was. Maritime analysts have described exactly this dynamic. Arrangements around possible tolls or coordination with Iranian authorities have remained ad hoc, with most shipping companies refusing direct engagement because of sanctions exposure. One analyst described the coordination question as a slippery slope for any company that might expose itself to penalties later. Some operators have taken the opaque route instead, switching off their transponders entirely to obscure their positions. Before this war, Iran had effectively no say over what moved through that waterway. That is the change Tehran is fighting to make permanent. And that brings us to the detail that changes everything about how you should read the last 11 nights. On July 8th, U.S. Central Command completed a round of strikes against Iranian targets explicitly framed as degrading Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping and civilian mariners in the strait. On July 9th, CENTCOM announced it had completed an additional round hitting approximately 90 Iranian military targets, describing them as air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, missile and drone storage sites, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure along Iran's coastline. Note what is on that target list: not nuclear facilities, not ballistic missile production, not regime leadership, coastal surveillance, air defense, naval capability, drone storage. Every single category on that list exists for one purpose, which is finding and hitting ships in a narrow body of water. President Trump had declared the memorandum over. A U.S. official told CNN the ceasefire had at least temporarily ceased. Another official told Axios that the escalation could last a day, a week, or a month, depending entirely on whether Iran continued attacking commercial vessels. That same official characterized the American approach with a phrase that tells you a great deal about the initial intent. They said the United States was going to slap them a bit. And that official attributed the collapse to frustration within a faction of the Iranian leadership who believed the deal with Washington had delivered nothing real for Tehran. A faction of the Iranian leadership, read that again, because it is the thread that unravels the entire official narrative on both sides. A slap does not last 11 nights. What was described as a limited punitive action on July 8th has become, by July 21st, the most sustained American air campaign against a nation-state since the opening phase of the Iraq War. And it did not escalate because Washington decided to escalate. It escalated because whoever is actually making decisions in Tehran did not stop and may not be capable of stopping. Let's talk about what has actually been hit, because the numbers are now far past what any single news cycle has captured. On July 12th, CENTCOM completed a wave of strikes hitting dozens of targets at multiple locations. On July 13th, another wave, concluding at 10:15 p.m. Eastern, with residents across southern and southwestern Iran reporting multiple loud explosions. That same night, residents of Jam, Khomein, and Aligudars reported missile launches at around 4 in the morning, and Bahrain's Ministry of Interior activated warning sirens and told residents to move to the nearest shelter. By July 16th, CENTCOM announced the sixth consecutive night of strikes and stated it was holding Iran accountable for attacks on commercial shipping. Iranian state media reported 5 bridges struck in southern Iran and 3 explosions in Chabahar in the southeast. Iran's Tasnim agency reported an American strike on Iranshahr Airport, with 3 explosions heard around a facility where Iranian armed forces are stationed. By July 19th, Iranian authorities stated that the United States had carried out attacks on 95 separate locations across 12 cities over the preceding 10 days. That is the Iranian figure from Iranian officials, describing damage on Iranian soil. By July 20th, explosions were reported in Bandar Abbas, Sirik Island, Shiraz, Bandar Lenge, and Keshem. Air defenses were activated near the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Explosions were heard near Isfahan, the site of Iran's largest nuclear facility, though the provincial governor stated no attack had been carried out there and that officials were investigating the reports from residents. And on July 21st at 8:15 p.m. Eastern, the 11th consecutive evening concluded, with CENTCOM stating it had targeted Iranian military operations centers, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and air defense systems. Now look at the geography of that target set, because the geography is the message. Bandar Abbas is the headquarters of the Iranian Navy and the primary IRGC naval base on the strait. Keshem and Sirik Island sit directly astride the shipping lanes. Bandar Lenge is a fast attack craft and small boat hub. Chabahar is something different and more significant. Chabahar is Iran's only deepwater port with direct access to the Indian Ocean, the single maritime outlet in the entire country that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz completely. It is the one port that would still function if the strait were sealed shut in both directions. Striking Chabahar is not about defending shipping in Hormuz. Chabahar is not in Hormuz. Striking Chabahar is about ensuring that Iran has no maritime option anywhere, that there is no back door, no alternative outlet, no ability to project naval force from a position outside the choke point. That is not a punitive campaign. That is the methodical elimination of an entire domain of national capability, one coastline city at a time. And Iranian residents said last night's explosions in Bandar Abbas came from the direction of the sea. Let's talk about how this is being executed, because the specific choice of platform is itself a message that Tehran's commanders are receiving very clearly. CENTCOM has confirmed that U.S. forces, including fighter jets, have conducted these strikes, and has released footage showing munitions launched from U.S. warships. The strike architecture that produces the kind of target set being reported is a layered one, and each layer solves a specific problem. The F-15E Strike Eagle is the backbone of sustained precision strike in that theater. 2 crew, 2 engines, enormous payload, built specifically to penetrate defended airspace at low altitude and deliver ordnance with precision. Against static, surveyed targets like a coastal radar installation or a hardened logistics facility, it carries GPS-guided weapons. The 2,000-pound class weapon is used against hardened or buried structures where you need the target to stop existing, rather than merely stop functioning. The 500-pound class weapon is used where the target is soft and the surrounding area is not, which matters enormously in coastal cities, where naval infrastructure sits inside civilian port districts. The F-16CM, the Wild Weasel mission, exists for one reason: to find surface-to-air missile systems and kill them, ideally by convincing the operator to switch on his radar and then writing the emission back down to the source. Against an air defense network that has been degraded but not destroyed, this is the aircraft that makes everything else survivable. Every night that Iranian air defense operators have to choose between illuminating and dying, or staying dark and being useless, is a night the rest of the package flies with reduced risk. Carrier aviation adds the FA-18 Super Hornet, which brings anti-ship weapons to bear against IRGC naval targets and can generate sorties from the water without requiring host nation basing permission, which in this region is not a trivial consideration. The EA-18G Growler adds electronic attack, degrading radar and communications across a wide area so that the strike package operates inside a bubble where the defender's picture of the battle space is unreliable. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Arleigh Burke destroyers solve a different problem entirely. They fly 1,000 miles, they fly low, and critically, they can be launched against the most heavily defended targets without putting a single American aviator inside the engagement envelope of any Iranian weapon system. The footage CENTCOM has released of munitions launching from warships is exactly this. When the United States uses a Tomahawk instead of a manned aircraft, it is communicating that it can hold a target at risk indefinitely at zero human cost to itself. MQ-9 Reapers handle the persistent hunt, loitering over coastal areas for hours, waiting for a fast attack craft to leave its shelter or a drone team to move to a launch position. Iran's side of the ledger is asymmetric by design and by necessity. Shahed-type one-way attack drones, which are cheap, slow, and effective in volume against fixed positions. Ballistic missiles, which cannot be intercepted with certainty and which impose enormous defensive costs. Fast attack craft operating in swarms. Naval mines, which the IRGC has laid in the strait, and which are the single most economically devastating weapon in the entire theater, because a mined waterway is a closed waterway regardless of who controls the air above it. Coastal anti-ship missiles, shore-based radar, and small boat harassment. That asymmetry explains the entire shape of the campaign. The United States is destroying the platforms. Iran is not trying to defeat the platforms. Iran is trying to raise the cost of American presence high enough and sustain the closure long enough that the international system pressures Washington into an arrangement. And this is where it gets significantly worse. On July 17th, Iranian ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones struck Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility at Azraq in the eastern desert that hosts U.S. forces and aircraft. At least 2 missiles impacted. CENTCOM confirmed that 2 American service members were killed, 1 was missing, and 4 more were medically evacuated to Jordanian hospitals. The missing service members' remains were subsequently located. Separately, an American soldier was killed in Iraq on July 19th during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. The Department of Defense has identified them. First, Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25 years old. Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19 years old. Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton of Fayetteville, North Carolina, 19 years old. The total number of American service members killed in this war now stands at 16. The response from Washington was immediate, and it was explicit. Around 6 in the evening Eastern on Saturday, the U.S. military conducted another round of strikes, and CENTCOM stated plainly that the strikes were designed both to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and to swiftly punish the Revolutionary Guard forces who launched the attack on American personnel in Jordan. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth called the fallen service members heroes and said their sacrifice stiffened American resolve. President Trump posted that every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over, and stated that this directive had been passed to every leader in the military. That is a doctrinal shift, and you should register it as one. A campaign that began as an effort to reopen a waterway now has a second and entirely separate justification: retaliation for American dead. Those 2 objectives can be pursued simultaneously, but they do not terminate at the same point. A shipping campaign ends when ships move. A retaliation campaign ends when someone decides it has been enough. There's no measurable threshold for the second one. That is precisely what makes it dangerous. Now let's talk about the money, because the financial track of this campaign is running in parallel and it is producing effects the military track cannot. On Tuesday, Secretary Hegseth testified before Congress and put the cost of this war at $37.5 billion. Analysts immediately noted that the figure does not incorporate operational costs already baked into the department's fiscal year 2026 budget of more than $1 trillion, which means the real number is meaningfully higher. In that same testimony, Hegseth said something that received far less attention than it deserved. He stated that the American operation guiding ships through the Strait of Hormuz had continued covertly after it was publicly announced in May, and that it had helped move up to 500 million barrels of oil through the waterway. He asserted that the U.S. military had been in control of moving traffic in the strait for quite some time. CENTCOM's own public figure is approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude facilitated since early May. Read that again, because there is a contradiction sitting inside it that is doing enormous work. The United States asserts operational control of the waterway. Simultaneously, public ship tracking data shows traffic has dropped sharply over the course of these tit-for-tat strikes. Lloyd's List: intelligence reported that no vessels above 10,000 deadweight tonnage transited the southern route with their identification transponders active after July 7th, though at least 2 are believed to have crossed dark. As of yesterday, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is described as being at a standstill. Both statements can be true at once, and the way they are both true is the real story. The United States can escort a convoy through that strait whenever it chooses. What it cannot do is make a commercial shipping company, a marine insurer, and a charterer collectively decide that the risk is acceptable. Military control of a waterway and commercial function of a waterway are 2 entirely different things. Washington has the first, it does not have the second, and Iran does not need to sink a single additional ship to keep it that way. It only needs to remain credibly capable of trying. That is why 11 consecutive nights of strikes have not reopened the strait. The strikes are destroying the capability. The capability was never the point. The perception of the capability is the point, and perception is not a target you can hit with a 2,000-pound bomb. Meanwhile, the economic pressure is spreading laterally in ways that were not part of anyone's plan. Houthi forces in Yemen have declared a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia. Jorge Leon of Rystad Energy has assessed that this threat puts roughly 2.5 million barrels per day of Saudi output at risk, and it arrives at the precise moment when Hormuz traffic has stopped. With the Gulf's primary maritime outlet largely closed, global supply is increasingly dependent on Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline and its Red Sea terminals. The Houthi declaration is aimed directly at the alternative route. That is not a coincidence, and it should not be read as one. Someone identified the single remaining pressure valve in the global energy system and moved to close it. Analysts at ING noted large remaining divisions between Washington and Tehran and flagged Trump's stated intent to retaliate for the deaths of American troops. Rystad has warned about the risk of a significant rebound in oil prices. So 3 tracks are now converging simultaneously, and the convergence is the thing, not any single track. The military track is 11 nights of sustained strikes systematically dismantling Iranian maritime and coastal capability, with over 50,000 American service members postured across the region. The financial track is a closed waterway, a collapsed export capacity, a threatened alternative route, and an Iranian economy that cannot legitimately monetize its primary resource. And the psychological track is the one nobody is talking about properly, which is that the Islamic Republic is fighting the most consequential war in its history with a leadership structure that was decapitated 5 months ago and has not been coherently rebuilt. That brings us to the question that matters more than any target list. Who is actually in charge in Tehran? The formal answer is Mojtaba Khamenei, supreme leader since March 8, 2026. He was elected by the Assembly of Experts. The IRGC, the armed forces, and the political leadership all publicly pledged their backing. President Pezeshkian called it a new era of dignity and strength. The real answer is considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous. Mojtaba Khamenei is not his father, and the office he inherited is not the office his father held. Ali Khamenei accumulated 37 years of personal authority, patronage networks, and institutional loyalty that were attached to him as an individual, not to the chair he sat in. That does not transfer. It cannot be bequeathed. His son inherited the title and inherited none of the accumulated leverage that made the title meaningful. Analysis published this spring described the resulting structure precisely. In the post-Ali Khamenei reality, power in Tehran did not reorganize around a single dominant figure. Mojtaba formally sits at the apex. But authority that was once concentrated in the Supreme Leader's office is now distributed across a narrow circle of military, security, and political figures whose portfolios and responsibilities increasingly overlap. The Supreme Leader is no longer the ultimate source of authority. He is the center of a complex war-focused leadership system, overlapping portfolios. That is a bureaucratic phrase describing an extremely dangerous condition. The Atlantic Council has assessed Mojtaba as more hardline than his father in both political ideology and jurisprudence, with close ties to some of the most ideologically extreme clerics in the system. He served in the IRGC ground forces in the closing year of the Iran-Iraq War, and held a position within the Basij from 2009 until his father's death. He spent 17 years as his father's vakil, his deputy and gatekeeper, which gave him unmatched knowledge of the system's inner workings and almost no independent public constituency. Iranian commentators had nicknamed him the Phantom of Tehran and the Shadow Prince long before any of this, precisely because he operated entirely without a public profile. Now look at the military structure around him. Mohammad Pakpour commands the Revolutionary Guard, appointed after the losses inflicted in the 12-day war of June 2025, with Vahidi as his deputy. Amir Hatami commands the regular army, the Artesh, having taken that role in June 2025, after a career that included running army military intelligence and serving as defense minister. These are 2 entirely separate armed forces with separate chains of command, separate procurement, separate doctrine, and a long institutional history of mutual suspicion. In a functioning system, the Supreme Leader is the sole arbiter between them, and the intelligence apparatus that would normally manage that friction has been gutted. Majid Kademi, who directed both the IRGC Intelligence Organization and the IRGC Intelligence Protection Organization, was killed in an airstrike in Tehran on April 6th. Both of his positions are listed as vacant. Ali Shamkhani, one of the most senior security advisors in the system, was killed the same day as Ali Khamenei. So assemble the picture. A supreme leader with the title but not the inherited authority, who was himself wounded in the strike that killed his predecessor, and who disappeared from view long enough to generate genuine uncertainty about his condition. 2 parallel military establishments with overlapping mandates, a decapitated intelligence structure with vacant leadership at the top, a parliament speaker conducting negotiations, a president who was a reformist in a system now dominated by hardliners, and A Revolutionary Guard naval command that has spent 5 months being told it holds the most valuable strategic asset the Islamic Republic has ever possessed. Now recall what that American official told Axios. The escalation stems from frustration among a part of the Iranian leadership who believe the deal delivered nothing real for Tehran. A part of the Iranian leadership. That is the entire problem stated in a single clause, and it is the reason this campaign is in its 12th night rather than its second. Here is the honest strategic assessment, and it is not what either side is saying publicly. The United States is winning the military campaign decisively and is not achieving its stated objective. Every night, more Iranian coastal radar, more air defense, more drone storage, more naval capability ceases to exist. Iran cannot replace these systems at anything approaching the rate they are being destroyed, and it cannot protect them, but the Strait is still at a standstill. Commercial traffic has not returned, insurance markets have not normalized, the mines that were laid are still in the water and will remain a hazard long after the last IRGC fast attack craft is on the seabed. Destroying the ability to close the strait does not automatically produce the confidence required to reopen it, and confidence is the actual commodity in short supply. Iran is losing the military campaign catastrophically and has not lost the strategic contest. It has demonstrated something it can never undemonstrate, which is that it can close 20% of the world's energy supply, and that the cost of forcing it open exceeds $37 billion and 16 American lives and counting. Every future negotiation will be conducted in the shadow of that proof. President Trump has now threatened Iranian power stations and bridges in an effort to force Tehran to loosen its grip on the strait, and has raised the prospect of striking nuclear facilities, with heavy attacks threatened against the deeply buried Pickaxe mountain site. Secretary Rubio has said Iran effectively killed the memorandum, but that the United States remains willing to pursue diplomacy. Those two positions are being held simultaneously, which tells you Washington has not decided whether this is a coercion campaign or a regime pressure campaign, and the difference determines everything about how it ends. For the next 48 to 72 hours, the available evidence points toward continuation. CENTCOM has stated that American forces remain postured and prepared. Air defenses were engaging over Tehran itself early this morning, which represents a geographic expansion beyond the coastal target set that has defined the last 11 nights. Iran struck a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz early Tuesday, forcing the crew to abandon the vessel. The IRGC has reported massive fires aboard 2 oil tankers in the strait. Neither side has produced a single indicator of de-escalation. And now the thing that should keep you awake, because it is not the headline, and it is not on any target list. The structural risk in this conflict is not escalation. Escalation is manageable. Escalation is what military planners spend their careers modeling. The structural risk is that there may be no one in Tehran with a standing to stop. Consider what a genuine ceasefire actually requires. It requires an authority who can issue an order to the IRGC Navy at Bandar Abbas, to the ballistic missile units in the interior, to the drone operators on the coast, to the mine-laying crews, and to the Houthi command in Yemen, and have that order obeyed by all of them simultaneously and verifiably. Ali Khamenei could have done that. It is genuinely unclear whether anyone can do it now. If authority in Tehran is distributed across a narrow circle with overlapping portfolios rather than concentrated in one office, then a negotiated settlement is not a document. It is a coalition. And every one of those figures has a different institutional interest in the outcome. The Revolutionary Guard Naval Command has spent 5 months acquiring more strategic relevance than it has ever held in its history, and a reopened strait returns it to irrelevance. The regular army has no such stake. The clerical establishment has a survival interest that may not align with either. A negotiator can sign anything he likes. Whether the man commanding a shore battery at Bandar Lenge has any reason to comply is a completely separate question. That is the fragmentation risk, and it is why the phrase, "a part of the Iranian leadership," is the most alarming sentence any official has spoken during this entire episode. It is an admission that the United States does not know who it would be making a deal with, or whether that person could deliver. An unauthorized strike, a local commander acting on his own initiative, a missile that lands somewhere it was not aimed. In a system with a single, unambiguous authority, those events get contained. In a system with overlapping portfolios and vacant intelligence leadership, and a supreme leader whose actual grip is unproven, they do not get contained. They cascade. And they cascade in a theater containing over 50,000 American service members, 4 American aircraft carriers worth of regional infrastructure, the Bushehr nuclear power plant, and the Isfahan nuclear complex. 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez was in Jordan, not Iran, Jordan. That is how far the cascade has already reached. 11 consecutive nights. 95 locations, across 12 cities by Iran's own accounting, $37.5 billion by the Secretary of Defense's own accounting, 16 American service members killed, A waterway carrying 27% of the world's seaborne oil sitting empty. A Houthi embargo closing the alternative route. Air defenses engaging over the capital of a country of 90 million people. And a supreme leader 5 months into an office he inherited from a father who was killed in an airstrike he himself was injured in. Last night, residents of Bandar Abbas felt shockwaves move through the South Elahiyeh neighborhood and said the explosions seemed to come from the direction of the sea. They were right. That is exactly where they came from. And there is no indication whatsoever that the sea is finished. If you want to keep tracking this as it develops, subscribe, because the next 72 hours are going to matter more than the last 11 nights did.